It began like any other calm morning, with Mason standing in his kitchen, steaming mug in hand, gazing out across the still lake he had deliberately chosen as his sanctuary from the busyness of the world. His home was more than just a house. It was a deliberate investment in peace, in research, and autonomy. He had purchased the lakefront property precisely because it sat outside the tangled jurisdiction of the local Homeowners Association, those boards that seem to thrive on micromanaging details of people's lives, from mailbox color to approved shingle patterns. Mason wanted none of that. His property represented freedom. He framed his federal research permit on the wall like a banner of validation. 8 weeks already logged of delicate loon acoustic monitoring, a project requiring silence, patience, and respect for the natural world. That morning up to this point was unremarkable in the best possible way. Sunlight glinting through trees, the deck stretching toward the water, a promise of quiet work ahead. Then his phone buzzed with the kind of notification you almost don't want to look at, because subconsciously you sense your serenity is about to be shattered. He saw an email subject line glaring at him from the screen. Event confirmation, Waterfront Community Day. His first reaction was confusion, then a spiral into something approaching disbelief. He opened it once, twice, then a third time, each reading not clarifying the contents but shocking him further. There, laid out in cheerful fonts, was something he had never approved. Never even imagined. His home, his dock, and his private drive all listed as the venue for a community celebration. Complete with traffic flow maps, arrows guiding parking onto his grass, and a note about accommodating 80 confirmed guests. The HOA President, Pamela Knox, had signed herself boldly as venue coordinator, like she was a seasoned event planner staging a festival at a property she didn't own. Mason nearly choked on his coffee. The absurdity was so severe that his body didn't know whether to laugh or explode. His first instinct was denial. It must be some clerical slip, some misaddressed filing that would vanish with a polite phone call. But the attachments destroyed that fleeting hope. There was a catering invoice with his name, his full legal name, billed as though he had personally contracted for platters and servers to feed dozens. Every line item screamed assumption, not possibility. Delivery scheduled to his dock. Table setups mapped to his shoreline. Invoices totaling thousands charged against his supposed consent. He slammed the mug down so hard coffee splattered across the counter, his hand shaking not just with irritation but with genuine fear. Strangers, dozens of them, were preparing to invade his sanctuary under the false impression that they belonged there. This wasn't a simple typo. It was someone reaching into his life, grabbing the rights he held in written county records and waving them around like stage props. That image burned into his mind. The dock jammed with unfamiliar boats bumping up against its weathered pilings. Kids shouting, coolers dragged across grass, music pulsing into the carefully measured wilderness soundscape. Every loon call drowned in human chatter. 8 weeks of painstaking recordings would dissolve into useless static. Scientific work built on patience and silence could be annihilated in a single day. Even worse was the brazenness of it. Pamela hadn't asked him. She hadn't even pretended to include him. She had taken his private land, clearly outside her HOA boundaries, and written it into a public bulletin, telling an entire neighborhood they had permission to treat it as their venue. Authority in her hands had mutated into something bolder than overreach. It had become fraud. Mason pulled up property records with desperate speed, needing confirmation. The screen glowed with undeniable proof. His deed, his survey lines, his name as sole owner. The house was distinctly outside HOA jurisdiction. It was almost laughable if not for the weight sinking into his chest. The very reason he had purchased this haven was now under siege. As if to hammer the point further, the catering contract referred to him as venue owner, Mason Hale. She wasn't borrowing his name. She was using it as though she had full authority to do business as him. He stood there in that kitchen, morning sun warm across the floorboards, but the mood had shifted entirely. The world felt suddenly hostile, his boundaries erased, his dignity challenged. This discovery wasn't just unpleasant. It was the opening volley in what promised to be a battle, where peace could be obliterated, not by accidents of nature but by the audacity of people who believed that power granted by a committee gave them ownership of another person's world. And from that single email subject line, Mason understood. His weekend, perhaps even his entire research season, had just tipped into chaos. Once the shock of the email began to fade, Mason felt the far more chilling weight of realization settle in. This wasn't one errant message. Pamela's fabrication was larger, deeper, and far more coordinated than he had first feared. A single forged email could be fixed in an afternoon, but as evidence gathered around him, it became terrifyingly clear that an entire web of deception had been spun, and everyone but him seemed to be caught in it already. Not an hour passed before the first phone call came. A friendly neighbor he hardly interacted with, cheerfully confirming how excited her family was to launch their kayaks from his beach this Saturday. The casual way she said it, as though his dock were a municipal pier, drove the point home. This wasn't rumor. It was gospel truth in the minds of dozens. When Mason corrected her firmly, telling her it was private land, she hesitated in stunned silence, as though she was the one being deceived, not him. The HOA bulletin, she claimed, specifically named his address. The certainty in her tone made his stomach drop. Pamela hadn't whispered a suggestion. She had declared a narrative, and the community had swallowed it whole. From there, the calls, messages, and pieces of evidence poured in like water through a cracked dam. A catering representative insisted that thousands of dollars in services were already locked in using his name. A vendor scouting the area had been caught on his cameras pacing along his fence line like a surveyor, clipboard in hand, making notes about space as though planning tent placement. Rebecca, his neighbor to the south, herself free of HOA oversight, turned out to be an invaluable ally, showing Mason entire strings of announcements on HOA community boards advertising Waterfront Family Day with promises of food, swimming, and boating festivities all staged on the Hale property. Even more official looking was a hand-drawn parking diagram Pamela circulated, arrows leading cars toward Mason's septic-strained driveway. Casually ignoring legal infrastructure limits, nothing in her communications suggested she had even spoken to Mason. Instead, she had claimed his property as an elementary school child might claim a toy, through sheer insistence and a loud enough voice. Each new revelation pressed deeper into Mason's chest. It wasn't merely neighbors being duped anymore. The deception had spread into layers of professionalism and economics. Vendors, companies, and insurers were convinced by polished presentations, contracts with his name forged onto them, or by sheer reliance on Pamela's status as HOA President. To small businesses, she projected legitimacy. To families in the community, she projected leadership and benevolence. And to Mason, she projected a looming catastrophe. When he contacted the county office for clarity, the clerk's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by a chilling pause and a suggestion that he document everything. That phrase alone made the blood run colder. He'd thought he was dealing with an annoying trespass problem. In fact, he was facing a carefully engineered scheme of misrepresentation strong enough that local authorities were already worrying about escalation, the most insidious part, far more than the catering invoices or the driveway. Scouting was the deliberate shaping of public opinion Pamela had tied into the fraud. Rebecca scrolled through posts that revealed how Pamela had characterized Mason publicly for weeks. Antisocial, aloof, the sort of person who would agree to loan his property just to avoid speaking to anyone about it. Suddenly, Mason saw the trap nested perfectly. To the community, his inevitable protests wouldn't sound like protests at all. They'd sound like crabby backtracking. A socially disconnected man trying to spoil fun after he'd supposedly agreed. His integrity was not only being attacked legally, but socially undermined in whispers even before the confrontation occurred. This wasn't random. It was systematic. Pamela knew authority in an HOA wasn't about truth, but about consensus. And she had built a consensus around her claim until, by sheer repetition, people believed it more than reality itself. Worse still, signs of material investment suggested Pamela had bet big on keeping the illusion alive. Businesses confirmed rentals arranged in his name, insurance applications filed under his property, and even scouting vehicles creeping into secluded corners. All proof she had walked into offices with fake authority and laid down claims as though they were incontestable. Mason could almost admire the audacity if it weren't his livelihood being shredded under it. This was fraud, yes, but not clumsy or one-off. It was insidious fraud woven into narratives, economics, and community trust. It had gone so far that even strangers in hardware stores were casually discussing his houses, the event site. What terrified Mason most wasn't the prospect of people showing up. It was how thoroughly they believed they belonged there. By evening, his quiet kitchen was transformed into a war room. Counters littered with printouts of deeds, septic certifications, federal research mandates, and screenshots of every fraudulent map or thread. The home that once looked out calmly on shimmering waters now contained a man hunched over his laptop, racing to stay one step ahead of his adversary's lie. Nora, seeing his drawn face, called it what it truly was: fraud. Rebecca added a sharper word: conspiracy. And Mason realized they were right. This wasn't confusion at all. It was a hostile attempt to seize control through confidence, through audacity, and through the assumption that no one would dare oppose the will of an HOA president. What Pamela didn't count on was that she had chosen the wrong doc and the wrong man. A man prepared to fight for peace with documentation sharper than any HOA memo. The deception had escalated into a neighborhood-wide fantasy, but Mason wasn't planning to let it turn into reality. By the time the sun slid behind the trees that night, Mason had crossed a threshold from disbelief into determination. Enough evidence of Pamela's deception was already stacked across his kitchen table to fill a courtroom exhibit. Printed ownership records, septic permits clearly limiting occupancy, the federal research license for his Loon acoustic study, and screen-captured posts from HOA forums falsely rebranding his private dock as community property. The disaster wasn't just looming anymore. It was scheduled, advertised, and rapidly approaching. Nearly 100 people believed they were attending a sanctioned festival on his lawn. Mason realized that trying to reason this away with a friendly phone call was pointless. Pamela was too far invested, and her narrative was already entrenched. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about control. And if he wanted to protect his property and years of painstaking research from collapse, he needed a plan, thorough, documented, and undeniable. The first step was clarity, prove himself, beyond question, to be the sole legal owner. Mason pulled his deed again, read it as though the ink itself might shift, and highlighted survey lines showing his boundaries. Those boundaries fell outside HOA maps, which meant, clearly, formally, unarguably, that Pamela's organization had no authority. He printed multiple copies, laminated one, and marked another for weatherproofing at the gate. The truth had to be not just accessible, but visible. Next came septic regulations, a seemingly mundane piece of bureaucracy now transformed into a critical safeguard. His system was rated for no more than 12 guests at one time, and accommodating 100 would trigger half a dozen serious violations. That detail was powerful ammunition, because not only did it strip Pamela of her imagined venue authorization, but it also meant utilities were prepared to enforce his side. If guests arrived, any official who saw those papers could immediately issue citations. The second step was surveillance. Rebecca, ever the pragmatic ally, offered her drone for comprehensive aerial evidence. Documentation is power, she insisted, already charging batteries and planning footage angles. The prospect of dozens of cars arriving at a chained gate, captured in crisp 4K video, gave Mason a flourished sense of protection. Alongside Rebecca's technology, he installed motion sensor cameras at the drive and property edges, ensuring that every car, every face, every attempt to scout would be captured. As Nora pointed out, anyone who tried to argue confusion could hardly do so once confronted with date-stamped footage of themselves measuring his fence line. Step 3 was visible defense. Mason bought steel chain heavy enough to secure his front gate, a padlock as reflective as sunlight, and a handful of official warning signs noting federal protection of research areas. He wasn't looking for a brawl. In fact, avoidance of one was paramount. But when the community arrived, the locked barrier needed to speak louder than his voice. People mistake words, twist emails, and misquote neighbors. But a chain flanked by written, laminated permits leaves little room for ambiguity. His plan became clear. Lock the gate at dawn on Saturday, mount signs at eye level, and leave legal designations visible. Documentation would block trespass more fully than confrontation could. Fourth came communication. Mason drafted formal notices labeling Pamela's actions as trespass and fraud. Copies addressed to the HOA board, the county sheriff's office, and the relevant environmental enforcement agency. Every word he chose carried weight. Calm, factual, meticulous, free of anger, yet filled with precision. This wasn't about emotions anymore. It was about evidence. His notes listed names of every vendor he'd contacted, transcripts from conversations where they admitted Pamela signed in his name, and invoices sent under false pretenses. For vendors like catering and rentals, Mason drafted careful statements affirming he had never authorized nor agreed to any arrangement. He knew bills would come, legal rumblings would spark, and perhaps even small claims would be filed, but his protection lay in gathering truth like armor, layering it carefully until the fraudster's noise would clang uselessly against it. Finally, Mason prepared not just for Saturday's spectacle, but for the greater arc ahead. Nora, sensible as ever, reminded him of the core mission, protecting the loon study. It wasn't just his house and lawn at stake. It was federally protected wildlife research. An invasion of noise and chaos could erase weeks of uncontaminated data, and one ruined nesting season might not be recoverable for years. That realization hardened him further. This wasn't selfish opposition to a neighborhood picnic. This was defense of a vital environmental project. To make that evident, he positioned his framed research permit near the entry wall and copied relevant sections, noise limitations, buffer zone restrictions, to laminate and post beside the gate. Any visitor would see instantly that disturbances weren't merely unwelcome but strictly prohibited by law. By midnight, Mason's war room of documents had transformed into a surprisingly calm command center. His evidence lined up in folders: ownership, septic, research, correspondence. Electronic backups lived on 2 hard drives in case of dispute. The chain and padlock gleamed in the garage, ready to clang into finality. Nora, watching his quiet industry, brought wine and offered a toast less to victory than to preparation. "Here's to doing it right," she said. And she was correct. Winning didn't mean drama or conflict. It meant preservation, proof and procedure airtight enough that lies could no longer breathe. Lying in bed after the midnight hour, Mason didn't feel peace. Not exactly. But as he listened to the eerie, ancient calls of loons echo across their lake, he felt alignment. Just as the birds cried to mark territory and boundaries, so too was he preparing to do the same in a human context. Except his call was not song, but documentation. Not wings, but padlocks. Not instinct, but evidence. Tomorrow the chain would click shut, iron and paper uniting as the shield against an entire community's misconception. And when those cars inevitably rolled down the gravel drive, Mason would be waiting not with outrage, but with facts sharp and deliberate enough to protect what mattered most. By Friday morning, Mason's quiet war of paperwork and preparation began to tilt dramatically in his favor. What had started as an exhausting, lonely effort to defend his home suddenly blossomed into a flood of community skepticism that grew sharper with every hour. Fragment by fragment, the uniform wall of belief Pamela had built around her waterfront community day began to crack under the weight of facts. The cracks did not come from Mason shouting, nor from law enforcement swooping in, but from something far more powerful. Ordinary people checking for themselves. It started innocently, with whispered doubts on the HOA discussion board. One parent asked why no signs of setup could be seen at the Hale property, given that the event was supposedly a day away. Pamela's vague response that arrangements were last minute rang hollow against the empty shoreline. Another resident uploaded an old HOA planning booklet, highlighting with satisfaction that Mason's parcel had always been outside jurisdiction. The proof was right there in dated maps and tax records. The effect was electric. Screenshots spread swiftly, dismantling the illusion that his home was part of the association. Suddenly, dozens of eyes that had trusted Pamela by default began scrutinizing her story with suspicion. Vendors began peeling away next. The catering service, once so confident, posted a blunt statement. They had been defrauded by misrepresentation and were already speaking with legal counsel. A rental company for portable restrooms withdrew, sharing photographs of contracts that bore Pamela's name but Mason's property details. Insurance agents, previously cheerful in their outreach, now flagged the attempted event coverage as fraudulent and marked her claims under investigation. Each business pulling out struck her narrative like another hole in a leaking ship. To the community, it became clear this was not a simple mix-up about permissions. Pamela had lied in ways that cost professionals time, money, and reputation. On Friday evening, Mason sat at his computer watching attendance numbers on the HOA's online RSVP system fall in real time. 80 confirmed guests fell to 50, then 37, then barely into double digits. Every cancellation came with some form of murmured apology. "We were misled. Didn't realize the property was private. Should have verified sooner." By the time dawn approached on Saturday, only a handful of diehards still believed a party might materialize at the lakefront. What had once looked like an impending mob had thinned into a few confused stragglers. The irony was almost comical. Pamela's imagined grand festival crumbling into exactly what Mason had always wanted: a private, quiet morning. The collapse was not merely numerical but reputational. One HOA board member, tired of fielding angry phone calls from duped residents, called for an emergency meeting to review the conduct of the president. The words fraud and liability were spoken aloud for the first time in official capacity, not whispered on message boards. By midnight, Rebecca texted Mason with triumphant restraint. Pamela just tried to cancel the event online. Her excuse? Unforeseen circumstances. Comments are tearing her apart. People aren't buying it. That phrase, unforeseen circumstances, became a mocking refrain echoed by residents posting photos of Mason's very obvious no trespassing and federal protected research signs. The circumstances weren't unforeseen at all. They had been boldly ignored. Saturday morning arrived like a test of how fully the truth had spread. Mason and Nora secured the chain across the gate, mounted laminated deeds and permits, and positioned cameras while Rebecca's drone zipped overhead, documenting every angle of the quiet road. For a time, nothing happened but birdsong and the distant call of loons. Then around 9:15, the first car trickled down, a sedan carrying a family expecting festivities. They slowed, read the signs, listened to Mason's calm explanation, and left with sheepish apologies. Next came a minivan, its children bouncing with anticipation, only for parents to pale as they read federal research site, no public access in laminated black letters. They had been duped, and the disappointment on their kids' faces reflected directly onto Pamela, not Mason. Only one last dramatic gasp disturbed the morning. The catering van, obligated by contract to perform a site inspection. The lead caterer, Miguel, barreled from the driver's seat waving a clipboard and demanding to know why he'd been lied to. When Mason flatly told him he'd never signed anything, Miguel's fury redirected instantly toward Pamela. The caterer turned his camera on himself, recording a blistering rant about being defrauded by the HOA president. Rebecca's drone circled overhead, capturing every second of this mini-collapse. And with that, the mirage truly burst. Families drove off. Vendors reversed vans down the narrow gravel road. By 11:30, silence fell again, broken only by loons echoing across the lake. The symbolism overwhelmed Mason. He had prepared for confrontation, for shouting, for trespassers spilling over his lawn. What unfolded instead was quiet retreat. Neighbors realizing they'd been misled. Vendors realizing they had been scammed, and an HOA president realizing her authority counted for very little against documented truth. Pamela herself never appeared at the gate. She posted a hasty resignation notice to her HOA forum, citing stress and miscommunications. But the community was no longer fooled. What they witnessed firsthand was collapse, not miscommunication. Her scheme didn't simply fade. It imploded under scrutiny. The trust she once wielded as HOA president had evaporated completely, leaving not a legacy of leadership but a cautionary tale. By Saturday afternoon, Mason leaned on his locked gate not with exhaustion but with a profound quiet satisfaction. The event that might have upended months of research and privacy had been destroyed not through confrontation but through truth's steady exposure. What Pamela had staged as an unstoppable wave of authority evaporated into a trickle of confused cars and bitter business invoices. It was almost anticlimactic, except for the fact that anticlimax was precisely the victory Mason had worked for. No trespass, no festival noise, and most importantly, a lake still ringing with loon calls undisturbed by human intrusion. Pamela's scheme had collapsed not because Mason fought her with equal fury, but because the community found themselves holding the receipts, and her lies couldn't stand up to the light. By Sunday morning, the dust had already begun to settle, though settle is too gentle a word for the kind of collapse Pamela's scheme had suffered. The internet, which had once carried her cheerful flyers and RSVP forms, now practically buzzed with receipts, screenshots of her false claims, contracts signed in bad faith, photos of a chained gate where families had arrived only to be turned away. What she had built through repetition and authority unraveled with equal ferocity once people began comparing notes. Neighbors exchanged guilt-tinged apologies with Mason, vendors published scathing statements of financial loss, and HOA members who had once let Pamela operate unchecked now convened secret emergency meetings to discuss liability. The board, once her rubber stamp, publicly accepted her resignation with flat, embarrassed language. But resignation was too light a word. This was ruin, complete and thorough. For Mason, the strangest part of the aftermath was its quietness. He had prepared for confrontation, for afternoons of angry shouting, for the prospect of police presence, even the possibility of federal officers if the research protections were breached. Instead, he woke Sunday not to chaos but to articles, statements, and screenshots flooding his phone, all confirming the storm was already past. Lakeside Catering, still steaming from their losses, wrote a public summary of their ordeal for the entire county to see, detailing how Pamela had used someone else's property to contract them. Local rental firms followed suit. Even an insurance underwriter form circulated warnings about fraudulent applications involving HOA presidents. Pamela's name, once one of quiet power in neighborhood affairs, was now synonymous with deception, and yet Mason felt a thread of sympathy woven into the satisfaction. Families had been lied to just as much as he had. Parents had bought picnic supplies, children had practiced swimming all week, all on the promise of access to a place that was never available. Their disappointment wasn't his doing, but he could feel its sting nonetheless. That sympathy, however, only strengthened his resolve. Misplaced anger at him had already shifted where it belonged, toward Pamela and the institution that had enabled her unchecked authority. When Rebecca showed him HOA message boards filled with residents demanding reforms, limitations to presidential power, mandatory proof of property rights before public announcements, Mason realized the embarrassment had shaken more than just one office holder. The association itself was mutating, correcting itself under pressure, adapting like a system exposed to its own weakest point. Pamela had intended to expand HOA control with a bold gesture. Instead, she had forced it to shrink its reach through reform. Then came something Mason hadn't anticipated. His situation quickly became a case study. Conservation groups and environmental educators picked up on the story of the researcher who defended his loon study from HOA overreach. Blogs praised him not for confrontation but for his methodical reliance on evidence, law, and restraint. The county environmental office even sent him a letter commending his defense of federally protected species under adverse conditions. That framed certificate now hung beside his research permit, two artifacts telling the tale not only of science, but of the fight to preserve the conditions necessary to do science in the first place. Meanwhile, the academic project itself thrived. With Saturday's intrusion thwarted, those delicate 8 weeks of baseline loon recordings remained uncontaminated. Chilling nights and dawn choruses captured in clear, untouched data. When Mason reviewed spectrograms weeks later, he could see the clean space where noise might have been but wasn't. The silence itself, a victory. His findings would soon become part of federal conservation reporting, and eventually peer-reviewed journals. In a strange twist of irony, Pamela's fraudulent event had not demolished his research but strengthened its context. Proof of how fragile such work could be and why safeguarding it mattered. Conferences invited him not just for the data, but for the story of defending scientific integrity from administrative overreach. At home, life began to reground itself in simpler rituals. The chain eventually came off the gate, stored in the garage as a reminder rather than a daily necessity, replaced with smaller professional signage marking the land's status as a federal research site. Neighbors who once viewed him as aloof now waved from porch railings, their admiration tempered by understanding. He hadn't been antisocial, he had been responsible. Even the fishing community rallied to his side, timing their outings to avoid disrupting acoustic monitors and reminding each other, proudly, how their cooperation was part of protecting something larger. The very community Pamela had tried to weaponize against Mason had instead been turned into supporters of his conservation work. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation was internal. Mason found his voice steady, where once it might have faltered under pressure. He learned that documents, not anger, were his greatest weapon. That boundaries defended calmly, with evidence tend to hold longer than boundaries screamed about in rage. And in some odd, almost poetic way, he realized that Pamela had ironically given him a gift. She had broadcast the existence of his project to an entire region. Where she sought to strip him of control, she had built inadvertent awareness and awareness in conservation, his oxygen. So as the season wound toward summer, Mason and Nora sat once more on their deck, sipping wine while the loons called across the glassy water, their paired cries carried, haunting, ancient, unbroken by the clamor of unwanted celebration. Mason thought back to those hours when it seemed 100 people might storm his shoreline, and how much effort he'd poured into preparation. In the end, the drama dissolved not with a roar but with whispers of truth spreading online, neighbors fact-checking their own assumptions, and a fraudster quietly resigning into disgrace. Sometimes, Mason reflected, the most powerful victory is the one where nothing happens. The loon calls remain unspoiled, the research steady, the property boundaries intact. The community learned, the fraudulent face fell, and the water shimmering in morning sun remained unchanged. His home stood in exactly the peace it was always meant to preserve.